Welcome, everyone. This is structured data capture, which means questionnaire stuff. My name is Lloyd McKenzie. I'm somebody who's been heavily involved in FHIR and in H7 for a long time. Most relevant to this presentation is I'm the technical lead. Well, I was the technical lead for the FHIR portion of the original structured data capture project about 4 years ago now, that was sponsored by the U.S. Office of the National Coordinator. And I am currently the technical lead of the follow-on project that sponsored by the U.S. National Library of Medicine, where we've done a number of things, including making the SDC specification international in scope rather than U.S.-centric, which is hopefully relevant here. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about it. I'm going to start by quickly walking through questionnaires, what they are in FHIR, and how they work. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about what the structured data capture implementation guide adds on to that. What are the capabilities that it offers? Talk a little bit about the timelines for publishing SDC, and how accurate I've been thus far whenever I've talked about timelines for publishing SDC, and then give you a quick demo of one of the apps that has been created that implements a fair bit of what structured data capture defines. The brochure sort of indicated that there was going to be a hands-on portion. As you can see by the fact that you have no tables in front of you, there is not going to be a hands-on portion because they gave me one slot instead of two. So your hands-on portion will be go off and play with it in whatever fashion you find appealing. Questionnaire is a concept that shows up all over in the healthcare space. Sometimes we call them forms, sometimes we call them case reports, surveys, whatever. But we see them in the clinical side, we see them in the administrative side, we see them in the research side. They are everywhere. And they're basically ways of doing data capture. Some of them are very simple, just a straight list of questions, but some of them get pretty complicated, and they've got tables, they've got different groups, some of which get enabled or disabled based on what other people choose. You can gather data of all sorts of different types, and ability to support those is a pretty important thing in healthcare, and Questionnaire is the resource that we use to do that. And it gives us control over what are the questions that can be asked, what order are they presented in, what ones do you have to answer, which ones are optional, all of that kind of stuff. Questionnaire response is the resource that we use to capture the answers. And we, at one point, had them combined into a single resource, but it turned out to not work terribly well when you have repeating questions and nested repeating questions. There was a fair bit of redundancy, and it made implementation difficult. So we split them apart, and there is obviously a tight linkage between the two, in that when you're looking at a response, you sort of want to know what question it's for. But we designed questionnaire response so that it can be interpreted standalone. We repeat the key information, like what was the question text, so that you can see what was asked as well as what the answer was without having to go and retrieve the questionnaire response. And in some cases, there might not be a FHIR questionnaire response. Questionnaire itself might have been represented in some other form, but you're still exposing the results in FHIR. Questionnaire response is really useful for capturing raw data and sharing the raw data. And it can also be used to present information. You can take data that you've already got in the EHR and load it into a questionnaire response so that you're showing it to either a patient or to a clinician in a specific way, labeled in a particular way. But it's not terribly useful for data retrieval and analysis because the meaning of the data is often dependent on previous answers or answers higher up the tree, which makes it really difficult to construct queries against questionnaire responses that are terribly useful. Questionnaire responses are also not really comparable unless you're talking about responses that were captured against the same questionnaire and often against the same version of the questionnaire, because as soon as the questions change, the interpretation of the data can change. In addition to the questionnaire and the questionnaire response resources, there's a few others that are relevant in this space. You can use the code system and value set resources as a way of defining what are the allowed answers for a particular question. You don't have to use them. You can define the allowed answers directly in the questionnaire itself. But if you want to reuse a particular set of answers across different forms or in multiple places, using these terminology resources can be helpful for that. We have concept map, which is useful when loading data into forms and extracting it from forms, but we're also exploring using it as a way of providing translations for forms, so that you can have a questionnaire written, say, in French, and then you can have a concept map that says, and here is the equivalent of that expressed in English or Japanese or whatever other language you want. Not quite what concept map was designed for. But turns out the link IDs in a questionnaire work kind of similar to the codes in a code system, and so we're exploring whether that will work. And Graham has said that we're not crazy, at least not in that sense, so we'll give it a shot. The other resource that's relevant here is Structure Map, which is used to transform data from one format into another, and that's also relevant in some places for being able to take data that's outside of a questionnaire, turn it into a questionnaire response, or alternatively take a questionnaire response and turn it into a questionnaire. And SDC has some guides to provide on both of those things. So what is the structured data capture project? As with most FHIR resources, questionnaire response, etc., are pretty open-ended building blocks. They give you a base set of capabilities that reflect what we think most systems that do questionnaires in FHIR can handle. But the reality is that there's tons of things that more sophisticated questionnaire systems in healthcare do and need to do, and there wasn't a whole lot of guidance on how to do those things. And so we created the Structured Data Capture Implementation Guide to try to drive some consistency, define mechanisms for supporting more advanced behaviors, and also setting expectations for what should a reasonable questionnaire authoring system do, or questionnaire maintaining system do, or systems that are responsible for handling submissions, etc. The SDC specification covers 6 major topics. It covers workflow, so how do we actually manage the questionnaire process. It covers advanced form rendering. It covers behavior within forms. It has mechanisms to automatically populate data into forms. So if you've got data in the EHR or some other system, that you could fill it in automatically, so you aren't always filling in what is your name and address and postal code and all of those other things that you fill in on every form that you ever see all the time, even though they should know. And in fact, they do know. That's what's on the form, so you get to fill it in again. But also the ability to take information that's in forms and extract it into other resources. So for example, you can capture things using a form, which gives you really tight control over what the user sees and how they answer the questions. But then you can take that information and move it into observations or into family history or medication statements or other resources that are much more comparable, regardless of how the data was captured, and much more queryable because the data is now context independent and is consistent in its meaning. And the last thing that we took on was adaptive forms, which are a mechanism for filling out a questionnaire where you don't actually know what all of the questions are in advance. You say, I'm ready to fill out a form, and it asks you one question, and you fill in an answer, and you send that back, and it gives you the next question, and you fill that answer for that, and it gives you the next question, and you keep doing that until whatever service you're talking to decides that you're done. And sometimes that's after 2 questions. Thanks, but we're really not interested in you. Or sometimes it's after 30 questions because you happen to be a really interesting person and they wanted lots more data about you. And it depends on sort of the design of that. And so you may never know what all the possible questions were. You just know the ones that you were asked. In terms of workflow, there's actually a whole bunch of workflow involved in the questionnaire space. How do you find the particular questionnaire that you're looking for? Because there can be hundreds or sometimes thousands of them. So what is the metadata that we use? What are the search parameters that we expect? a reasonable questionnaire repository to support. If you have a form that points to allowed answers that are maintained elsewhere, what are the mechanisms for retrieving those? And determining what is the set of medication codes, for example, that you're allowed to choose from as of right now, because that might be different than it was last week. When somebody's filling out a form and they want to save the form partway through, or they want to indicate that it's complete, what's the process that we manage that? If you want to allow completed forms to be submitted to somewhere for processing, what is the operation that we use for that? What if we want to say to a patient, you know what, I would like you to fill out one of these forms and I'd like you to do it every Tuesday sometime in the afternoon, and have them prompted for that? What are the mechanisms that FHIR gives us to do that sort of thing? And how do we know whether or not they did what they were supposed to, and can track that? And also, how can we create a questionnaire that picks pieces of other questionnaires, so that rather than writing everything from scratch every time, we can get reuse across forms and design things once and then reuse those chunks. So those are all different pieces of form workflow that SDC tries to answer. On the rendering side, sometimes forms are pretty boring. Everything is all just same font, same text, one question after another. But some clinicians, some other questionnaire authors are slightly artistic, and they want to inject color, and they want to inject different fonts, and they want to inject pictures and other things that perhaps make the form more useful and more meaningful. And of course, the base questionnaire resource doesn't do that. They don't give you any ability to control style. They don't give you ability to inject images and that sort of thing. But there are forms that need that. SDC defines how you do that. Sometimes you have forms where some of the questions are answers that you don't actually get to control. So you're filling out things, and down at the bottom there's an answer, but it's calculated, and you can't go into that particular question and change the value. It's calculated for you, and sometimes you don't even get to see that. So behind the scenes, they're calculating a score, but because it might change how you're answering the questionnaire. If you knew how the score was turning out, you're filling out a psychiatric assessment, and depending on what the answers are, there's a value, but it's behind the scenes. And when you submit the form, the receiver will see that, but the person who's filling it out won't. How do we flag things that way? A default FHIR questionnaire is basically going to ask you one question after another, everything in a nice straight line. But people have been designing forms for a long time, and sometimes they want things to appear in a grid. So here are all of my questions. My answers are vertical, and I make a choice, or perhaps it's the other way around. The questions are across the top, and the answers are vertical, and I make a choice. And there's a variety of other layout types in terms of how things might be designed. And if we want the data that we're capturing to be consistent with how things have been captured on paper forms, it's important to keep the representation consistent, because when you see things in a table form, the way that you answer can be different than when you're asked one question after another. And so we need to be able to repeat that in a somewhat consistent way. We also might want to have control over, should this be a sliding scale grid? Should it be radio buttons? Should it be checkboxes? Should it be drop downs? And within those, if I have a bunch of columns in my drop-down list, what should those columns be? How wide should they be? All those sorts of controls are necessary when you want really tight rendering of your form, but none of that is provided by the base questionnaire resource. So we have extensions for all of those things and guidance on how to use them. And then simpler things like, I have a form that wants to capture a social security number, which is 3 digits followed by 3 digits followed by 3 digits. The typical way that you see that on a paper form is you've got a box, and then in very faint text behind that are the NNN-NNN-NNN, and we can do that in computer screens. And how do we do that? Another extension. On the behavior side, we sometimes want to change what the questionnaire looks like based on what kind of data has already been captured. So in the base form, we have an enable when capability that lets you say, turn a particular question on or off based on a previous answer. But sometimes it's not as simple as if answer 1 is true, then turn this on or off. Instead, we want to be able to do more complex things like look at the last 10 questions, calculate the score based on those answers, and then if the score was above a particular value, then we're going to ask some more stuff. If their score was low, then we don't really care because they're going to be fine. We don't need more detail. But it's the score that matters, not the specific answers. And there was no good way to do that, so we have an extension to support that. Sometimes you actually want to change what the possible answers are. So you will turn on particular options based on when somebody was born, or whether they're male or female, or whether they happen to have diabetes or hypertension. You can control what answers are available in the form based on that. Sometimes you have constraints that span across questions. So I want you to fill out this list of 5 questions, and you can answer some of them as not preferred or very preferred or whatever, but there's a constraint in terms of how many you can answer in a particular way. And so we have an extension for that. If you're getting the sense that there's lots of extensions in SDC, you are correct. Another thing on the behavior is we want to be able to constrain what values can be entered. So I only want you to specify between 5 and 10 characters, or the date range needs to be between this start value and this end value, or the value that you entered needs to match a particular regular expression. Maybe you're capturing an attachment. Somebody can attach a PDF or maybe a picture, and you want to control that it actually is a PDF or is a picture, and more importantly, it's one of the picture formats that you actually know how to read and consume. And you'd prefer that they didn't attach a 10 gigabyte file. You want something that's slightly manageable, so you might place a maximum on the size. When you have answers, the base questionnaire allows you to capture, is this something that is allowed to repeat, or is this something that's mandatory? But we don't, in the base questionnaire, tell you anything about how many repetitions are possible. But sometimes you need that. You want to say you have to answer at least 3, but you can't answer more than 5. And again, that's something that we have an extension for. One of the things that FHIR introduces that you don't typically find in legacy forms or in paper forms is the ability for an answer to be a reference, a pointer to something else. So I can have an answer that says, who is your general practitioner, and select from a drop-down and pick the GP, rather than just typing in their name and their license number in the unlikely event that you actually know what that is. Or you could pick a location. What clinic would you like to go to? And here's the list of possibilities. Or of the medications that you're on, which of these are suspects in the adverse reaction, and be able to bring up that list and then pick from that list which ones are considered to be relevant. And so we have this basic ability of you can point to other stuff in the base questionnaire, but there's nothing that lets you control what those choices are. So you could theoretically point to any resource imaginable, and that's not generally the behavior you want. You want to be able to at least constrain what kind of resource it is, but sometimes also what profile that resource is conformant with. So are you looking to capture heights and weights? Are you looking to capture blood pressures? Are you looking to capture lab results? What is it that you want? And sometimes you actually want to specify the query. Here is what you should execute against your system to come up with that drop-down of things that people can choose from. A key part of complex behavior is calculations. There are lots of forms in the healthcare space that are focused on doing calculations, creating scores. And so there's a number of capabilities that we've introduced around that. One is that when you're opening a form, that the form editing tool has some context about what is going on that is relevant to this form. So who is the patient? What is the encounter? In the research space, maybe what is the study? So that you can leverage that information when you're going either to populate things directly, because if you know the patient, you know the name, you know the phone number, you know the date of birth, the gender, all of those wonderful things. If you know the encounter, you know the admission date and admission reason, that kind of stuff. But you can also then go out and query other things that are tied to that. So if I know who the patient is, I can go and look at their vital signs, or I can go look at their lab results or their medications. We have support for both CQL and FirePath, which is sort of a subset of CQL, to let you go and query and look at information that's in the form, in the EHR, and bring that into the form and to do calculations. And there's a few different ways that we can do calculations. We can actually set what the value of a particular question is. We can use that to turn things on and off within the form. We can also use it to provide guidance. So maybe we can't figure out what the answer should be, but if the question is, was the patient on any concomitant medications that could be relevant to this reaction, really hard for logic to make the determination could be relevant. That tends to be a human thing. But we can at least bring up what was the list of concomitant meds so that the provider can look at that and go, yeah, that one, not that one, and pick from that list to fill in the answer. Or another, so in that case, they're choosing from the list for the answer. Another possibility is, has this patient had a similar procedure in the past? Yes or no? Again, determination of what constitutes a similar procedure tends to be something that requires a clinician's head or some human's head. So you can bring up a list of past procedures. You're not going to pick one of them as this is the one, because they don't want a specific procedure. They just want a yes or no. But you can look at that list and make a determination of, do you want to answer yes or no? So all of those things are things that SDC defines mechanisms to support. And we also provide the mechanism to create one form, building up from others. Prepopulation and population in general is an area of significant interest to all sorts of people. Filling out forms sucks. It takes lots of time. And of course, every piece of data that you enter is a piece of data that you can potentially get wrong. You're looking at something in the EHR on one screen and then filling it in on the form, maybe copy and pasting, maybe retyping, and sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you grab it from the wrong place. So if we can take information that already exists and load that into the form before it gets displayed to the end user, that's really helpful in terms of improving data quality and in terms of providing a better experience for the poor soul who has to fill in all this information all the time. In order to do that, obviously you need to know who it is that you're filling the form in for and what the context is. And then you need some sort of mechanism for mapping the data that lives in the electronic health record in the way that that's exposed, most likely through FHIR. That's what we are focused on. And what the different questions are. So do you split name apart into first name, last name? Are you taking date of birth and turning that into an age as of now, or are you just storing the date of birth? All of those kinds of transformations you have to deal with. And then you have a processing engine that can execute those logical mapping statements to fill the data in. There's sort of two modes for operation. One is prepopulation, where you do all of the logic first and then display the partially filled in form. But there's also mechanisms where, as the user is filling in certain answers, you can then go out and say, okay, based on what you've told me thus far, I can now fill in other parts of the form. So more sophisticated engines can actually be dynamic and filling in more parts as you go. The expectation is that in the end, the user still chooses what data is going to be filled out and what's going to be submitted. So we might fill a bunch of stuff in and they might go, yeah, no, that's not right, and they might change it. Or they might say, yeah, I don't want that included, and they can remove it. But it starts out with a decent set of information being there. There's 3 different mechanisms that we defined to do the population function. We defined 3 different mechanisms because there's the easy, there's the slightly harder, and there's the very hard, but they have different levels of capability. So the easy one is easy to do, but doesn't do very much, whereas the very hard one can do anything you can imagine, but it's harder to do. And because there isn't necessarily a sweet spot, different implementers are going to have different capabilities in terms of how complex a form they can author, and different needs in terms of what they want to fill in. Different things made sense. Observation-based is driven by the presumption that most of the data that we capture on forms in healthcare is around observations. What did you have for breakfast, and what was the input volume versus the output volume? What was the height, weight, blood pressure, all of those kinds of things. How are you feeling today? All of those are point-in-time observations, and that's what a lot of forms is built up of. And if things are that simple, you have a question which corresponds to your observation code, and you have an answer that corresponds to the answer in the list, and the mapping is really, really simple. This question, this code, this question, this code, this question, this code. You don't need any transformation, you don't need any funky logic. When you're populating, all that you really care about is how far back do I go. So if I'm interested in your blood pressure, I probably don't want the one from when you were 2 years old, when you're currently 30. But your blood type when you were 2 years old is just fine, because that doesn't tend to shift very much. And so you can make determinations on what time range is relevant when you're looking to populate and go grab the one that's most recent. But that's really all that you need, is what's the code and what's the time range, and that can then be filled in. Obviously, you need to have a sense of what the codes are, which for things like vital signs, FHIR actually nails down and says, if you're going after height or weight or systolic blood pressure or body temperature, these are the LOINC codes that must be present. Other stuff might also be present, but you can be confident in those. But if you're looking for something like what was your APGAR, or what is your red blood cell count, those are not standardized internationally. So you need to be operating in an environment where your jurisdiction, your country, your hospital, wherever you're getting your data from, has standardized what are the codes that you're going to use for that particular type of measurement, and then you can create population that will extract based on that. And if you're in an environment where you're getting data from all over the place and you have no idea what the codes are, then you can choose some common ones, maybe someone's from LOINC, someone's from SNOMED, and say if it's any of these, then I want that. And if it's not, then I guess I can't populate, and the user has to do the hard work. So most of you probably can't read that, but what we've got here is a snippet of a questionnaire, and at the top we've got a extension that says what is the period of time that we're interested in results from. In this case, it's for 3 months. And then we've got codes that say this is body weight, and it could be this LOINC code or this LOINC code or this LOINC code. This question maps to all of those, and that's really all that you need to have in the questionnaire in order to allow this to automatically get populated for. So what would happen is, behind the scenes, this system would go and create a query that says, go take the patient from my current context and find me observations where the code matches this LOINC code or this LOINC code or this LOINC code, and it's complete because, yeah, that matters. We don't want the ones that are entered in error or something like that. And based on what today's date is, here is the date that I want them to be greater than, and sort by date and give me the most recent one. And that's what gets executed behind the scenes. And whatever comes back, if something comes back, you then take that and stick that into the answer. And you would do that for all of the questions in the questionnaire that happen to have that link period filled in. If you're not dealing with observations, say you're dealing with something as simple as patient name, and I want your first name and I want your family name. But in the patient resource, there can be 3 or 4, 10 names, and you can have multiple given names. So I need some logic that lets me figure out, of the possible names, which is the one that I should grab, and then out of that collection of 3 names, which is the one that I display as the first name. And you can do all of those things with FHIR path statements. So you can create inside your questionnaire, here is the FHIR path to grab this from my patient context resource and know how to fill that in. FHIR path is, of course, a little bit more complicated to write than just saying, yeah, grab it for the last 3 months and here's the code. It requires a little bit more skill, but it's not necessarily super complex to write something like that. And so we have that as a possibility. The last mechanism, actually, I think it was still, I'm missing the slide for the last mechanism. The last mechanism is structure map, which allows you to create complex mappings that use contextual information, can iterate through collections, can perform transformations, can do code mapping, to do pretty much anything. I mean, we can convert from CDA into FHIR, we can convert from version 2 into FHIR, and we can certainly convert from FHIR into an arbitrary questionnaire. How ugly the mapping language ends up looking is dependent on how closely aligned or not aligned your questionnaire is to what the data source you're grabbing from is. We have the same approach on extracting data. So just as you can take information out of the EHR and put it into a form, sometimes you have a completed form and you want to extract information from that into the EHR. So I want to take what was captured as last menstrual period before pregnancy, where I might go and query for menstruation period information in the EHR. I'm going to then put that out into a different observation because this is now tied to a specific pregnancy, but I can do that. And again, you can tie that based on observation and time period. You can do that using FHIR path, and you can do that using structure maps. And the SDC specification has examples of how to do all of those things for at least certain sample questionnaires. Another thing that we have is this notion of adaptive forms, where you can ask a question, fill in an answer, get the next question, fill in an answer, ask the next question, and fill in the answer until such time as you have all of the answers that you want. And that is something that SDC fills in. And the way that works is, rather than having an established questionnaire that you point to, you start out with a questionnaire response and a contained questionnaire with no questions in it. And then over time, the set of questions builds up, and you end up with a questionnaire that is specific to your specific answers. Somebody else comes in 10 minutes later and fills out the same form. They will have a different custom questionnaire that reflects the questions that they got asked based on the answers that they gave. Each of those questionnaires, of course, references a base questionnaire that is the authoritative instrument that you're driving from, but it may be that nobody sees what that actually looks like. It's sort of hidden behind a black box of whoever manages that particular instrument. Obviously, there's a lot of complexity here, a lot of capability in terms of what can happen. And talking with the EHR vendors, a lot of them have said, yeah, that looks like fun. No, we're not taking that on. We've got way too much stuff on our plates right now. So support for a lot of the structured data capture functionality, some of it is, of course, being taken on by EHR vendors, but a lot of it, we're looking at things like smart apps and web-based applications, et cetera, to manage, where you have somebody who their primary purpose in life is creating forms and creating software that knows how to display those and manage those appropriately. And you can use Smart to then go in and query or get permission to go in and query the EHR. So you still have access to the data, but the EHR doesn't necessarily have to build all of that capability directly into its specific system. So one of the systems that this did not take me where I wanted it to take me. So let me go find the place where I really wanted to go. And then let me show you. So LHC Forms is a smart on-fire application that was created by the U.S. National Library of Medicine. And it supports not everything that SDC allows, but it supports a large chunk of it, and their intention is eventually to support everything. And if anybody wants to come and play, it is open source, so they are perfectly happy to have help. But you can pick your patient, and you can then either open an existing questionnaire, so they've already got one here for coronary heart disease, or you can go and pick something else that hasn't been filled in yet. But you'll find that, actually let's do this one. So fill in the Surgeon General's report, and it automatically fills in some of the information already. So it has support for prepopulation, it has support for calculating scores, it has support for relatively complex rendering, and you're free to take that and use that in your own system, or adapt it, or add additional stuff to it, or support the development to add additional capabilities and make them available to everyone. So that is how we're expecting a lot of the SDC capabilities to be present, at least in the near term, is through smart applications like this. There's a fair bit of interest in the US in the payer space about presenting custom forms for, oh, you're interested in getting this particular therapy. Here's the questions that we need answered in order to evaluate prior authorization for that. There's also interest from the research community in terms of, let's define the forms for this particular study, but let's suck in as much of that information from the EHR as we can, rather than having to enter it from scratch. So you may have forms that are specifically custom designed for particular solutions, but you'll also have apps that are form agnostic. You point to the form, pass in the context, and they will render it accordingly. So that is what I had hoped to share with you around structured data capture. In terms of timeline, when I presented about SDC in January, I said we expected to publish sometime in July or August. When I was presenting in June, I said probably in October or September. I'm currently saying probably February. The set of outstanding items that people have provided feedback on is diminishing, but they keep adding more. The good news is that I'm getting more bandwidth to start applying changes, and February I think is pretty realistic, but we'll see. It's coming soon for a given definition of soon. And certainly we have weekly calls, and if you're interested, they're not horrible in Europe because we have participants in Europe. It's a little late in the day, but you should still be awake. And we also have participants in Australia, so it's really fun to schedule those calls. But you are certainly welcome to come and join us.
Do we need to be HL7 members for this?
The question is, do we need to be HL7 members for this? You don't need to be HL7 members to be involved in any HL7 discussion or participation. The only thing that you need to be a member for is if you want to be a co-chair of a work group, you have to be a member. And if you want to ballot HL7 specifications for free, you need to be a member. And the cost is such that if you're planning to comment on more than one ballot in a given year, you should be a member because it's going to cost you less. Other than that, anybody is allowed to show up to any call. Anybody is allowed to vote on any call. Only governance bodies like the financial or the fire management group or the technical steering committee have closed membership, restricted to members, and you can show up and talk, but you can't vote. But yeah, absolutely anybody can come.
As an application developer, perhaps not an EHR developer.
Yep.
Let's say we want to make use of these questionnaires. I mean, it kind of crosses into the territory of like a user interface programmer. The question comes up, how can I facilitate this into our software engineering workflow? I mean, are there like JavaScript, TypeScript libraries that render these things, or like component libraries? What do you suggest that
Yep.
a developer initiate, start using these things?
Right, so the question is, from the perspective of an app developer, a software developer, how can we leverage this within our own applications? So the sample application well, it's not a sample application, the application I showed you is written in JavaScript, and it's open source, so you can certainly take components of that or all of it and embed it in your system. Fire is SDC and Questionnaire is absolutely about user interface. And so you can obviously hard code a specific user interface for specific data, but if you're wanting a generic user interface where you can plug and play user interfaces that others have defined, Questionnaire is a good way of making that happen. And you decide how sophisticated do you need to be. So how do you really need grid type presentation, or can you just do simple question answer? And that's going to be driven by the needs of your community. Last question?
An SDC questionnaire example library would be super useful, I think. Or is the app you just showed the go-to place for that?
Question is, where can I find a library of sample SDC questionnaires? And the answer is yes, there are a bunch of them provided with that tool. One of the main things that we've been doing in this release of SDC is building up our set of example instances. And we're certainly willing to receive more, but we're trying to make sure that we have examples that cover all of the different capabilities that we've defined and show what population and extraction looks like in different contexts. We won't have as many as people would like because there's no such thing, but we'll certainly have more and better ones than we used to. I still have tracker items from the very first release of SDC that say need more examples that I haven't signed off on yet because I know that we still need more examples. So yes, that's coming.
Will they be linked from the implementation guide?
They will be linked in, they will actually be embedded in the implementation guide and validated against the profiles so that we know that they are in fact doing what they're supposed to. All right, thank you all.